The next Renaissance is not around the corner. We are not on the brink of a golden age. There is too much psychotic self-hate in our souls. Look at our disgusting modern art. Look at all the garbage Hollywood remakes, dead stories where the hero must be someone else, yet Europeans are cast aside and slandered. But this is the problem. Self-love was the spirit of the Renaissance. European man became fascinated by his own image. He tried to sculpt himself in stances of high glory. He saw himself as God's masterpiece. He made sure to study this masterpiece meticulously. This is why Da Vinci's notes are full of anatomy diagrams. This is why they dissected bodies. This is why they said man is the measure of all things. The Europeans were rejoicing in their own beauty. They were thankful that God had given it to them. How can you rebirth that spirit in an era of psychotic self-hate? Are we getting a renaissance? Is there a golden age around the corner? You will have many digital gurus like myself tell you that we're on the cusp of a new renaissance. We're on the brink of Athens Part 2. It's all about to happen. Cryptocurrency has created the funding systems. Artificial intelligence is now giving us the capacity to generate a new renaissance. We can now type into AI and get it to create all these statues just like the old renaissance. And it's all going to be the same again. We're going to get to Renaissance Part 2. But I have bad news. We are not going to get a renaissance because of one very particular reason, and this is psychology. That uncomfortable thing that technology can't seem to properly fix. The way that we think. This is the question of psychology and culture and how it may get in the way of us having a new renaissance. What we're going to look at today is some theories about the Renaissance by Friedrich Nietzsche, by Ian McGilchrist, and various people like this, that will show us that we are not going to be able to have a Renaissance because we have a mental illness right now that is worldwide and culturally enforced. And this mental illness is the mental illness of self-hate that is particularly coming out of Western people. You will notice that most Europeans have a very degraded sense of themselves, and a lot of people around the world may even encourage them to think this way about themselves because of their historical crimes. And so the average self-image of a European person is something very ugly. You are a demon, you are nasty, you have no culture, your food is not spicy, your culture is evil, your culture is demonic, your statues are bad, you are an innate original sinner. There's some type of monster living within your soul that caused all the ills of the world. You are like Satan, the fountain out of which all pain and suffering comes from. You're a pretty big problem. And most Europeans, Westerners, people even in America and Australia, they've internalized this way of thinking in an absolute sense, and this is essentially promoted worldwide at scale. Now, the problem with this is that a renaissance requires self-adoration. It requires an enormous self-confidence and a desire to glorify. Now, you might say to yourself, Steph, you're just trying to bend all this stuff to be crazy and be conspiracy tart or whatever it is, but there's actually pretty solid evidence for this. So let's take a look at some examples. Take, for example, the statue of David, the most famous statue of all of the Renaissance, made by Michelangelo, an absolute masterpiece of human civilization overall, maybe one of the peaks of mankind's great struggle against death in all of history. And you might say to yourself, well, of course he made that because he felt inside of his soul universal compassion. He felt inside of his soul this deep, deep desire to feel ashamed and contemplate his sins. And you would say that the psychology of this man is that he just wanted to try be as nice as he could or something like this. But this is all incorrect. All of this is wrong. This is all a mistake. This is all us projecting our modern values, which are very incorrect, onto the past and hoping that's how it worked. But if you just strip away, if you be a Nietzschean and throw away all moral preconditions and take a look into the past, you'll actually see the true psychology of what was going on. The purpose of the Renaissance was to mug. The purpose of the Renaissance was to make fun of your enemies. The statue of David was commissioned by the Republic in Florence in order to mug the Medicis. They had just ousted the Medicis out of their city. They had just scared them off and defeated this great foe. And they made David because David was the guy fighting against the Goliath. And they were celebrating their power and their capacity to own their city and stick their finger up at a big bad capitalist, a big bad banker, and said, screw you, man, get out of here. They turned around to Michelangelo and they said, I want you to commission something. So I'm going to give you this big rock, and I want you to find inside of it something so beautiful that it represents our power and our strength. When Michelangelo came across this big rock, He said that he saw there was an angel trapped inside of it, and it was his divine duty to unleash this glory. Now, to even drill this concept home, there was then a response to this statue of David, an actual dialogue in statues, which shows you what was going on at the time. The Medicis later came in and took over this city. And there was another rock lying around that there was a plan for Michelangelo to craft something else in. But the Medicis had come in and taken over and interrupted these plans. And so what the Medicis did is they took this rock and they gave it to another sculptor and said, I want you to craft something that symbolizes our power. And so what was crafted out of this rock was another famous statue called Hercules and Cacus. And Hercules and Cacus is Hercules holding down Cacus like a little cock at his feet and standing there strong and proud, but naked as well. And the implication here, of course, again, the dialogue that is happening is the Medicis are saying Hercules, the big, strong, powerful 1%er, the big bankers, have come back in and they have beat down the little plebs who are trying to stand up to them. Now, what you're seeing here is a war taking place in the realm of art. And so it's crucial to understand that the psychology underneath these famous statues was not something of them demonstrating their charitable power, them demonstrating their love for all of mankind, them demonstrating the modern values that we cherish so much. Instead, it was the self-interested parties, which is the Republic of Venice with David and the Medicis with Cacus and Hercules, trying to create forms in stone that represented their power and gave them the capacity to mob. It was psychological warfare. It was an act of artistic competition. It was a power struggle manifest in art. Now, you compare this to our day and you look at the art that we're producing, and what type of dialogue does this imply? It's an awful lot of griping and whining and complaining. It's actually very sterile. You look, for example, at modern movies, and the impetus of modern movies is to create remakes and take minority figures and place them into positions of heroes of older comic book films or something like this, or older classics or something like this. Or take, for example, the tendency to tear down statues across the West for the sins of the colonial past. And then you look at what is put up in its place, and it's often not very good. They put up maybe these like weird postmodern bug entities, or maybe some doctor in a nurse suit or something like this. This is clearly not high art. It's clearly not them representing a majestic and powerful self-image and a majestic and powerful replacement. Instead, it's actually largely, as Nietzsche would say, resentment-driven destroying of something that is great, because they can't compete with it, and then they pull it down, and then they try to put something in its place, but it's not inspiring, it's not magical, it's not glorious. And this all signals the mental illness that is underneath Western culture. And if we expect the Renaissance to come out of this, we're going to be surely disappointed. All we'll end up doing is destroying the past and then trying to make something, and it will just be a flop and crap and useless. Now, what I'm getting at here is that the spirit of the Renaissance had a sort of sports-like spirit of fair play and good competition. It wasn't like this universal peace that we all aspire to now, where there's no conflict. In fact, the Renaissance had loads of conflict. Michelangelo, when he wasn't building statues, was busy building the ramparts, the walls around Florence, to defend them from armies. There was plenty of competition going on. There was plenty of war and conflict. And it's more the fact that this war and conflict was done with good spirit. They had a sort of sense of sports-like fair play. When the Medicis took over Florence, they didn't destroy the statue. They didn't go and pull down David. They said, that's a really good-looking statue, but we're going to make a better one. We're going to call our boy and we're going to make Hercules and make you look even worse. So there was this desire to have a dialogue and to mock, and there was a mutual sense of self-respect, and there was an open desire for conflict. It was actually a bit more barbaric, classical style world where there was war, there was virtue, there was aggression, there was conflict, but there was a good spirit underneath this. Now, in our day, it's not like that at all. It's an awful lot of griping and whining and this feverish desire to destroy things that are great in order to put something that is worse. There's this lack of good competition, lack of good sports spirit, this desire that everybody should get a medal. And if everybody gets a medal and everything becomes peaceful and the best people, get on their knees and accept that they're hurting people's feelings by being the best and by self-glorifying themselves with their art, they're the people who are, upsetting people. They should stop doing that. They should learn to be more polite. This is how we'll get great art and a Renaissance. But no, In practice, it turns out it's the opposite. It leads to floppy, frumpy crap that no one likes. And something quite nice about this as well is that if you really understand this psychological point that we're speaking about, you'll begin to understand Nietzsche's whole project as a whole. Because Nietzsche would look at the Renaissance and Athenian Greek as essentially these blossoming points, these high points of all of world civilization. And he would say that the way we should really structure our thinking, our entire moral map and framework, is to say to ourselves, how do we get to those moments? How do we reach this? Because you already see the meme is there. You have all the online gurus saying we're just about to have a Renaissance. Everybody knows a Renaissance is a good thing. Everybody loves a Renaissance. A Renaissance sounds great until it's about to get real, until you have to actually, live through the psychology of the Renaissance. And Nietzsche was just capable of tearing off all those pre-assumptions and saying to himself, how did these Renaissance people think? And you bury into their minds and you see this obsession, this worship of self. And it goes far beyond simply just being mogtastic and making fun of your enemies. The whole spirit of the age was all about self-adoration and self-obsession. And not in some low-resolution, narcissistic way of understanding this, but actually a very, very high-quality understanding of it. This implicit idea that your body, your entity is a creation of God's. And so if you study yourself, you come to understand the great creator because he made you as the most perfect animal in the world. You are the champion of life and God made you. So therefore you study yourself and you glorify yourself. You're in some sense glorifying God. It's a pretty healthy way of thinking. It develops a very natural and happy self-confidence. But that's not what we have nowadays. Instead, we have all sorts of pathological ways of thinking about ourselves. Europeans are ugly, evil, nasty, cultureless, bad. Mankind itself is dirty, disgusting, evil, bad. We're meaningless. We're this tiny little speckle on this meaningless little blob or something like this. There's this kind of disgust for the body in general. If you start to talk about things like the ideal form of the body, not being maybe overweight and stuff like this, or you say that, God and nature impressed you with a certain body when you were born and you should not disrespect that needlessly for any type of crazy ideas you get in your head. All of that stuff is assaulted on first principle. That's literally transformed into a moral taboo. And that's the exact thing that was at the center of the Renaissance. And again, this is not me just putting this stuff together. You go and study the time and you look at the culture and you'll see all this. What was Da Vinci doing? What's Da Vinci famous for? He would run around and he would dig up bodies and he would bring them. This is obviously a big sin against the church. And he would bring them at night. They'd sneak in, they'd rob a grave, bring the body, put it on a table and start to dissect that thing and study it. And say, man is the measure of all things. Through man we discover the divine. Through man we discover God. And they went into the body. And they went immanent. And they were like, what's this? And he's looking at the tendons and the vessel. We wouldn't have modern surgical science. We wouldn't have modern anatomy. We wouldn't have so many things. You wouldn't have modern medicine without Da Vinci having this psychological obsession with mankind's body, trying to perfect his form. And he was doing all this so he could get the perfect grafting pictures, so they could get all the muscles correct. And then when you look at Renaissance paintings and you look at Renaissance pictures, you notice this, that there's a flawless perfection to them, that there's something, it's almost like looking at a photo, It's so realistic, and it's because of this. It was this attempt to perfectly capture the people, perfectly capture man himself, perfectly capture him in his pure essence. So they would, split the bodies, check out all this stuff. And then the philosophies that were going alongside this as well were the exact same. You see this rise of essentially humanism, which is, again, this idea that man is the center of the world, as I'm speaking about now. And the dignity of man as the individual, and coming to understand the value of man as a individual and making the most out of him. And so the relationship between this and the art is clearly shown in the attempt to represent man in his maximum dignity. You walk into the room with Michelangelo's David, and this is a graceful, profound figure. It is a enormous figure, first of all, but it's standing there with this sort of relaxed pose of power and majesty the proud conqueror who defeated the Goliath, you know. There's something incredible about this. It's man in his most dignified way. You look at so many of the statues and so many of the images, and it's this attempt to represent man at his best, man at his most mighty. This is why you see things like, you know, a mythic hero cutting off the head of some type of enemy, conquering the demon or something like this. It's giving this flash. It's like a highlight reel of an MMA fighter, you know. An MMA fighter's life might be like pooping and burping and collapsing after his weight cut, and he might be, you know, snot coming out of his nose, and maybe he gets punched in his face and his face wobbles and all this. There's lots of images of this that show us the dirty and ugly side and difficult side of life. But then if you look at his highlight reel, it'd be like this thing where he just knocks a guy out, clean out with this flawless punch. He dodges a punch, comes back. There's a set of highlights, of majestic super moments. And this is sort of what the Renaissance is. It's a highlight reel of mankind, if you want to think about it this way, with this idea of celebrating the peaks, saying that the peaks happen. The peaks happen. There is glory in being a person. Many times it's been achieved, and we've lived through it. And the myths are just representations of these peaks. And these artists go in, they try to grab these peaks and represent them in stone to make them permanent and do them with the maximum amount of perfection. That's the spirit of the Renaissance. That's not here now. Now there's an attempt to represent the degraded, the broken version of man. Let's make a statue of somebody who's got too much cellulite so we can celebrate. We celebrate even the ugly. It's literally the inverse. It's literally about psychologically lifting up the things that are already broken and sick, the things that are damaged, the things that actually make us depressed and demoralizing. And this is something Nietzsche speaks about in Twilight of the Idols. That if you hold the image of the sick, the decrepit, you know, if you wanted to convince a guy to get into MMA, how would you get him excited about it? You know, you would hold up pictures of the highlight reel and say, this could be you? Or would you hold up pictures of the snot and the blood and the black eyes and the crying and the wife screaming at him and the lack of money and stuff? Is that which would you do? And maybe you say to yourself, well, look, you're being realistic by holding up the shitty suffering version. Fair enough. But at the same time, if you want to inspire someone to leap into the world and get into MMA, they need to have that high goal of like, I'm going to be glorious in some sense. So you have to show them the glory. And we don't do that. Our art is about demoralizing, putting people down, about making people depressed. And so if you think of the thing that we're trying to hype people up for, which is life, we're doing the absolute opposite. We're discouraging people from participating in life. All of our art is about destroying the soul of man, degrading the soul of man because of our incorrect psychology. We've got a cultural mental illness. And so our problem is that we cannot have a renaissance until we start to have a psychological revolution. We need to develop a new moral way of seeing the world. This is Nietzsche's thesis. We need to develop this whole new way of looking at our reality and saying to ourselves, are we going to haggard ourselves with shame? Are we going to celebrate suffering as some type of glorious thing? Or are we going to learn that the whole point of art and culture is to lift up the glory and dignity of man and represent that correctly to ourselves? That's a really big challenge because it's like, you know, you go to self-help and people really struggle with positive thinking. You deal with the average person, you know, and people are very negative because life is tough and the toughness of life beats them down. And then they start to think negatively and they become cynical, jaded complainers and they become losers. And then all of their life gets distorted into something negative and they demoralize themselves out of life. And then they can't work hard and they can't go after things. And so they get more depressed and then they end up losing more. And then so it starts to self-reinforce and then they become a dork and then they become a failure and a loser. But then one day on YouTube, Tony Robbins is there and he's like, listen, just stop saying nasty shit to yourself. Start being nice. Start being positive, man. Positive thinking, you know. Start visualizing your future. You might whisper to yourself, it's like, fuck that shit. That's a lie. The world is hard. The world is negative. I'm realistic. I'm cynical. I'm pessimistic. I know what's up. I'm clued into the Schopenhauerian reality of the world. The world sucks. But the thing is that if you start to control your mind, control your perception, and start to perceive glory and seek it. It's like the Jungian shadow has been conquered and you begin to reach for the glorious self. You start to understand that there are victories to have. You start to visualize. You visualize the Lambo. You visualize, you're like Conor McGregor in the car park, visualizing that you're driving a Lambo. And all of a sudden, the positivity starts to ramp up. You start to believe. You start to see potentials. You start to see avenues, opportunities, you know, because you're thinking about the future. You're more aware of opportunities. People mention stuff to you and you're like, that actually might work with the thing I'm thinking about all the time. Before you might have said, that's never going to work, and you ignore it. Now you're trying opportunities out, and sure, you fail, but eventually some of them start to work. And all of a sudden the cascade of power grows. Now take this psychology and scale it to a culture, and you can see exactly our problem. Constantly hammering negative imagery and depressing images and shame-based imagery is going to demoralize and going to lead to a very pessimistic and cynical culture. And then the opposite, one that's celebrating glory, is obviously going to excite people. So much so that now 500 years later, people still spend all their time talking about the moment of glory, which was the Renaissance. That's how much it hyped us up. And if we want to do it again, it happens here. Now, it does not stop there. The psychology of the Renaissance goes even deeper. There's many rabbit holes with this. And I'm taking this from Ian McGilchrist. Now, Ian McGilchrist, you will read his book Master and Its Emissary, and you'll notice that the whole second half he's talking about Nietzsche. He's talking about the birth of tragedy. And you're thinking to yourself, what is going on here? And he's pointing out a Nietzschean framework that Nietzsche set up. Because Nietzsche's birth of tragedy is this theory about why a golden age happened in Greece. Now, you might say, why are we talking about Greece, Steph? Well, the Renaissance was the rebirth of classical culture, and the idiosyncratic, the fountain of classical culture, was Athens. Because at that point, mankind was essentially in the permanent dark age. There had never been a high culture really before, is the kind of idea. Maybe Egypt had some cool stuff going on. But the point is that come around about 500 BC, so this is 500 years before Jesus, come that moment, there is an explosion of magic that happens in Athens that creates the first high culture and is essentially creates the apex of Western culture. That's where it happens. Now, Nietzsche then says, well, we should study this. The Greeks are the first event in culture, he says in Twilight of the Idols. Now, why should we study this? Because something happens there. So Nietzsche thinks there's a psychological thing that happens. Because in the run-up to 500 BC, there's a lot of phenomenon going on in Greek culture. You have Dionysian festivals, which would be like, Burning Man or something like this. They're kind of pagan and people go and dance and they get drunk or they take drugs, this type of thing. It's very physical, maybe sexual, maybe intoxicating, the Dionysian festivals. And then there's also these statues. The Greeks seem like they got this from Egypt, where they build these statues of these good-looking youths called koiros. And this is very Apollonian. It's very shaped, it's formed, this type of stuff, And there's this moment where these two things synthesize in these grand cultural events called the Dionysian festivals, that involve kind of theatre plays. So several things happen all at once. So you sort of have like this Cannes Film Festival where everybody gathers into a Greek amphitheatre and they sit down and they start to watch plays, the first ever plays. So it's like the invention of cinema. The first ever films are put together. The first ever plays are put together. And this is where we see the birth of the tragic play, which is where Nietzsche gets the name from. And in these plays, you have singing, you have choruses. Obviously, the Dionysian festival framework itself has been taken and used through these plays. And you have, images and figures and masks going and all this type of stuff. So a lot of really important things happen here. And alongside this as well comes the Olympics, which is this great institution of competition. The Greeks have this enormous amount of competitive spirit, and they literally create formal institutions to have these competitions against each other. And when this happens, Nietzsche says that there's a psychological synthesis that takes place between the Apollonian kind of sterile force of making statues and the Dionysian energetic force of running around naked in a forest taking drugs, banging to your head to folk music. There's a synthesis that takes place and creates this moment of high culture. It is energized and it's got this power underneath it. And this sort of Dionysian intoxicating energy leads it towards being mythical and heroic and majestic. And so the Dionysian plays are all about, building up energy and having this sort of feeling to it. It's driven by this. It's not sterilized and realistic, and that actually comes later. And there's also form to it, and there's lyric and things like this. So it's a synthesis of all. And it becomes a high culture moment. And he's sort of getting at this idea that something enormous is happening inside of the mind. And what happens then is, as Greek culture goes on, it eventually breaks apart. So we see that the plays after the Golden Age, the plays begin to get more realistic. They become less glorious and mythical. They become more Apollonian again. and they kind of break down a little bit. And Socrates comes along, and the plays themselves stop even being too dramatic, and they start to become ranting about philosophy and stuff like this. And this is a signal that the psychology is breaking apart and it's going down, and people are becoming spurgs. People are becoming internet Twitter bros or something like this. Now, Ian McGilchrist puts forward a sort of modulation on this theory and says that Nietzsche was right in kind, that there was a sort of problem where man's psychology had not reached its apex. And when it reached this synthesis, this apex, when this moment happened of the golden age of ancient Greece, something magical was happening within the mind of man. And Ian McGilchrist's idea would be that the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere synthesized together. They locked together. They got locked in, and they made stuff happen. And so before this, you see all these fascinating traits where if you look at the various things like statues, the way they made statues, they're very kind of like frigid. You look at the statues of the chorai, of the youths, and you can see how Greek statue comes out of this only like a century later. But they're very like standing straight, like they've got a pole up their arse, and they like look straight ahead, almost like this kind of like flat, soulless gaze. And they don't really look like people. They're more the abstraction of the concept of a person. Actually, the Greeks themselves thought of them as like the abstraction of youth. And so it is standing there, and it's the glorious body of a healthy, strong youth or something like this. But there's still a sort of sterility to it. There's something off about it. You look at it and you can tell that it's kind of like a figurine. And Ian would even point out that in the run-up to this as well, a lot of the early art didn't even have the capacity to represent people as a whole. Oftentimes it was just these little figurines without faces, because the left hemisphere can't really recognize faces, which is quite weird. And it was these figurines that would have like big bellies or maybe big boobs or something like this, or big strong arms, or there'd be this representation of body parts, but there was this inability to grasp the whole. And so it's a really weird way of thinking, but Ian McGilchrist is basically saying that it was almost like they were trapped in the left hemisphere for a while, and they were stuck in this little way. And you look at the art, and an awful lot of their perception, because remember, you perceive the world through your mind. The art they're producing has all these traits of left hemisphericism: glassy gazes, sometimes no faces at all, focusing on parts but cannot comprehend the whole. This sort of representation of things as opposed to this desire to get perfect detail. And then what happens in 500 BC in the transition over into Greek statue, which is this famous stuff where you see these naked figures that have the same pose as the statue of David had. You see, it's almost like the early AI gets dipped and taken into now AI that's photorealistic. There's this enormous transition in a very quick period of time. And it's this transition out of this frostiness into this three-dimensionality, this capacity to grab the exact image, and this sort of individualism and personality. So no longer are these statues of the chorai these images of the abstraction of youth standing like a rigid floorboard. Instead, it transforms into people. You look at the Greek Athenian statues and you're like, that could be a person. All of a sudden they develop poses. They develop a way of holding themselves. They have faces. You can tell that they're probably modeled on an actual person. The details become flawless. They get very, 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 very clear images of how the body looks. They get proportions correct to the point now where we look back at these and we say, like, that's a Greek, I'd love to have a Greek body with the muscles, because the muscles are all defined. All of that stuff starts to become clarified and clear and profound. All of that stuff starts to become detailed. They start to get shape and form. And Ian McGilchrist is going with this idea that these are all right hemispheric traits. This is what the right hemisphere does. The right hemisphere has the capacity to grasp a whole. The right hemisphere has the capacity to get context correct. The right hemisphere has the capacity to see the big picture. The right hemisphere has a bias towards realism and clear clarity. The right hemisphere does not recognize abstractions. It sees specific individuals. All of this. So it's like a transition happens. A psychological revolution takes place that leads to the golden age of the Greeks. And the left hemispheric ego gets cocked for a while and becomes enslaved to the right hemisphere, who controls it and tells it how to do its job. So he's getting at this idea that there's some profound synthesis. It's a little bit different than what Nietzsche says, but it's actually advancing the idea, and he's pretty good evidence for it. Now, he says an awful lot more about this, but this is the kind of basic thesis. And alongside of this, you see all these very interesting phenomenon show up. There becomes an obsession with individualism, an obsession with things like democracy, which is the concept of the perfect individual citizen and creating lots of individuals and having them work together. Like all of that stuff comes at this moment. The concept of materialism, the grasping of the natural world. Philosophy is natural, science is natural philosophy, the grasping of nature, looking out at nature like the right hemisphere would and seeing it as a thing that you can relate with, that's specific, that has knowledge to teach you, not casting an abstraction on top of it. And all of this begins to form in ancient Greece, and it leads to a golden age, like a blossoming, a fountain. And then for 800 years, this is antiquity, this is ancient culture, and they develop on this. Like the way that we still look back in the Renaissance, the Romans and the later Greeks and Alexander and the Hellenic Empire all looked back at ancient Greece, at ancient Athens as the moment, as the Renaissance moment, you know? And they were taking that culture and spreading it. And then what happened is come around about 200 AD, 300 AD in Rome, weirdly, the statues start to develop the frostiness again. It's very weird, and Ian makes the case about this. Like we have in Rome things like, you know, the lagoon statue that just looks amazing, unbelievably detailed. They clearly refined this capacity. But then there's this transition point where all of a sudden they start to get a little bit more frigid and all this, and they start to lose their glares. And it might be a bit anti-Christian now. But then as they go into the Christian era, statues, they stop making statues. They start to pull down statues. They start to break noses off the faces of statues. They start to destroy them. They even have this problem of iconoclasm in the early church where they begin to scratch out faces. And so Ian's making the case that the left hemisphere arrives again and imposes its specific will upon the world and starts to cut down this representation of man as an individual. It's very interesting theory. And what happens with the Renaissance? It's the same thing. It's very weird because as we go down into, I guess you could call it the Dark Age, I know some people might get mad at that, we see the rise of a type of art that's kind of like, again, low resolution. You see these medieval cartoons, which are very funny, but they're a bit two-dimensional, you know? They're a bit flat and frosty. And you see this transition then from medieval art into Renaissance art that again sees the exact same thing happen. You go from these kind of two-dimensional cartoon medieval figures that don't really get everything right, and you can see that it represents something, but it's not really the specific individual. And then this transition happens during the Renaissance where you get like something like the Mona Lisa. Why is that such a big deal? Because when you look at the Mona Lisa, you're like, that's a literal person in 3 dimensions with blotches on her face, with a perspective in the back. It's like literally a photo. You see again the same thing happen with the statues. The statues go from being something that is, you know, maybe not really a high art, and transforming once again into the exact same project as ancient Athens, the Golden Age project of glorious statues. And this explosion happens, and you see all this transformation in perception. And so there's this idea that there's this war, psychological war constantly happening. And the Renaissance, ancient Athens was this burst of this Golden Age, and then it fell down at the fall of Rome. And then boom, the Renaissance was it again. It makes you ask some awkward questions about our time. Because are we now living through another fall? We've seen actually a very similar breakdown to what happened at the end of Rome, where we had this Golden Age, we had this Renaissance, and it carried on until about the late 19th century. And then when we came into modernism, there's this breakdown into modern art. And I know, maybe we have a go at modern art a bit too much, very, very, very stereotypical trad take here. But if you look at modernism, it starts to develop all these same left hemispheric traits. It becomes highly wordy. It becomes highly obsessed with abstraction. It almost looks like a schizophrenic break. All of a sudden, everything becomes about representation, vivid 3-dimensional imagery and capturing things exactly as they are. All of this stuff starts to get cast out. It's weird. We might be going through a fall now again, who knows? So all that is to say is that there's a science to Renaissances. There's a science to making Renaissances happen. But the people nowadays who are promoting this, saying that we're on the cusp of one, they're not following the science. They don't know what's up. They don't realize what it would take to have a revolution 2.0, a golden age once again, Athens part 2, the Renaissance Part 2. They don't realize the stakes, the context, how it works. And this is it. People study this stuff. Nietzsche, Ian McGilchrist, they look at it and they say there's a psychological root to this. And our psychology is indicating that we're basically on the wrong side of that. If we wanted to have a golden age, which people like Nietzsche would say is the only thing that gives life meaning, interestingly. If we want to have that and create a highlight reel of our mythic power, we're going to have a revolution in here first. So I hope you enjoyed my black pill on the Renaissance. I'm afraid you're too mentally ill for it to happen. And if you want to have one, well, you're going to have to change the hard part. Do the heavy lifting in here. And a lot of those problems out in the world will start to solve themselves. That's the grounding of it. Now, if you enjoyed this, I actually have an extended version of this very topic that I talk about for 2 hours over on uberboyo.com. It is a premium subscription, so you'll have to subscribe to sign up to have a listen to it. I will link it down below, and I think you will enjoy it at length. I obviously go into these with more detail. I have a lot of pictures in there to illustrate the various things that we're talking about here. I show you some of the examples of the transitions from early Greek culture into Athenian Golden Age culture, some of the statues, the little details that you can notice. I show you the same thing with the transition from medieval art into Renaissance art. So you can actually look at this stuff in detail, look at it clearly and see what's going on. So I think you will like this if you like this thesis so far. So head over there, check it out, subscribe, and tell me what you think on the inside. Thank you very much for your time, my friends. Stay juicy and bye-bye.